We want to welcome each of you to episode 5 of the Abundant Life podcast. We're so thankful that each of you have tuned in to be a part of this study with us. My name is Brian Egerton, and I'm joined, as always, by John Ferguson. And we are excited about the opportunity of this podcast as we're able to deal with different mental and emotional and social issues that are a real challenge for so many of us in this life. And we want to look at them from a physiological perspective, how they affect us, and also from a spiritual perspective, and talk about how we can learn and grow and develop even through these different challenges we face in life. This is actually part 2 of a series we're dealing with involving grief. Last week, we began this series by talking a little bit about what grief is, what it looks like, and the different stages of grief that we go through in the grieving process. And so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, I'd encourage you to go back and take a look at it, because it builds some of the groundwork for our discussion this week. So this week, as we continue our discussion on the topic of grief, we're going to transition and talk a little bit about how to comfort those who are grieving. So as we think about this idea, there are maybe 2 concepts that John and I think are really important that we need to consider as foundational pieces for comforting those who are grieving. The first thing that's really important for us to talk about and for us to understand is that everyone grieves differently.
Yes.
And that there's no right and no wrong way to grieve. There are people have different experiences in life and different resources that they can use to help them in their grieving process. So everyone's going to grieve a little bit different. And in fact, to help illustrate that point, there's a man by the name of William Worden. And William Worden is known for his study in grief. In fact, he's known for creating a task-based model for the stages of grief.
Okay.
But one of the things he talked about in grief and mourning is he suggested that there are 7 mediators for mourning. And basically what this means is there are seven different main factors that are going to determine the intensity in which someone may mourn and grieve. And I just want to mention them real quick, and then we'll talk about a few.
Okay.
The first one of these 7 mediators, as he said, our grief or our mourning can be intensified by who the person was that died. The second one, he said, is that it's determined by the nature of our attachment to that person. The third one, he said, was how the individual died. The fourth mediator here he mentions is historical antecedents, and so what that means is what's the person's grief history? Is there unresolved grief in their life? Different things like that. What's their history of grief? The fifth one he mentions is personality variables. The sixth one is social variables, and the seventh and final one he mentions is concurrent stresses, and so this is talking about the other issues that may come up after someone has begun grieving. So he said these are 7 mediators, 7 different factors that help determine how someone grieves. So John, in thinking about these 7 mediators, what are some of them that stand out to you that really are going to have a profound impact on how someone may grieve?
Well, I think about who the person is. I mean, the closer your relationship, it could be a parent, could be a sibling, could be a spouse. And I think that depends on that. That impacts the grieving process. But not only who it is and the dynamics of your relationship, but also how that person passed or how the death occurred. Was it something that was expected, something long-term, short-term, or say that that person died unexpectedly, or that person died through an accident, or just simply passed on in his or her sleep. So I think who the person is and the relationship that you have invested, the emotional investment, and not only that, but how that person passed will definitely deal with us emotionally of how we respond.
To build on that a little bit, you think about the second one he mentioned. Second mediator is the nature of our attachment, and I think that goes hand in hand with those two you mentioned, because there may be two individuals who both of them their father passes away.
Yes.
One of them, their father was a crucial part of their whole life. They're all the time at every one of their little league games.
Yes.
Taught them a lot of things in life. Was there and celebrated a wedding with the person, or was there and celebrating in the hospital when they had a child, and so they had this really close relationship with their father. But maybe you have this other individual who maybe their father wasn't around for most of their life.
Yes.
And so both of them lose their father, but one of them is going to be impacted by the loss of their father more than the other. So the nature of that attachment is going to have a significant impact on the way someone may grieve that loss. But another one of the mediators that I think is really crucial that impacts the way someone grieves is the sixth one he mentions, which is social variables.
Yes.
Now I think about the support system that someone may have. Maybe someone has a great group of family that lives close by, or maybe it's a church family, or maybe it's another organization that they're a part of, and maybe they have these resources available to them to help them grieve, and so having that support is so important. But maybe someone that doesn't have that support is going to struggle when it comes to working through and dealing with their grief. So, we can look at all of these factors and look at all of these different mediators that are going to determine how someone may grieve, and so we can understand that everyone's going to have different mediators in their life.
Yes.
So everyone's going to be different when it comes to these things. So with that being the case, everyone's going to grieve differently.
Yes.
So just because, John, you may grieve in a different way than I do, that doesn't mean you're grieving wrong.
Yeah, that's true.
It just means that we grieve differently.
Right. There's a lot of other factors that come into it as far as that concerned. You brought up some excellent things about relationships and things of that nature, and that connectiveness. Yes, that impacts it. So the grieving process would probably a little bit more intensive, perhaps even last even a little longer going through as far as functionality is concerned. But no. That determines a lot about our level of grief and the time or the consistency of it.
So we think about these foundational concepts that we need to think about when we're helping someone that's grieving. The first thing that we need to remember here is that everyone grieves different. So as we're helping someone, we need to keep that in mind.
Yes.
But there's a second thing that is really important if we're going to really help someone that's grieving, and that's the fact that there's no set timetable for grief.
No set.
Talk a little bit about what that means. What does it mean that there's no timetable for grief?
Well, there's no timetable. Is that there's not a set time boundaries that if you haven't reached that particular point at that time, then perhaps you haven't grieved as you should have, or you are not progressing for as your grieving process. But I would simply say that, like any other relationship that may happen, some compare that to that of divorce. There's a death, so to speak, and someone would say, if you're not within that 12 to 18 month, people would think that, or the 2 years or so, then you haven't grieved as you should have. But I would be thinking that there is no limit, because all the other factors involved, the time involved, and the intensity and the importance of relationship, all of those things are involved. As a matter of fact, I would be thinking, to be honest with you, that we never get to a point where we no longer grieve altogether. I think that we may have some periods where we will grieve heavier than others. We may have some episode, but no, there's no time limit for grieving, because each person with their relationships, with all the resources, all of that would be different.
So there may be some people that can go through the grieving process in just a couple months, but there may be others that take them a couple years.
Yes.
And so it's important we understand that just because someone hasn't concluded or got through their grieving process as quickly as maybe we think they should, that doesn't mean there's something wrong.
Right.
See, as long as someone is continuing to progress and not digress in their grief, then it's not a problem with how long they're grieving.
That's right.
The only issue that comes is if someone does begin to stall in the grieving process, or if they begin to move backwards, and are unable to try to slowly get back to a somewhat normal life, then maybe there's something more to it. Maybe their grief has turned into complicated grief, or maybe has even shifted into depression, and at that point it becomes a problem.
Yes.
But just because someone isn't progressing as fast as we think they should, that doesn't mean there's a problem with their grief.
That's right.
So understanding these two ideas are really important when we're trying to help someone that's grieving, to know that there's not a wrong way to grieve. Everyone's going to grieve differently, and that there's not a set time when someone should have worked through this.
That's true.
When we understand those two things, I think that really helps us when we're trying to comfort someone who may be hurting and grieving in their life.
Yes.
So last week, as we began our discussion on grief, we talked about, we looked at the example of Job from the Bible.
Yes.
And we considered how he walked through these different stages of grief. This week, we want to continue thinking about Job, but we want to focus in on his friends. Because there are some really good things that his friends did to help him in his grief. But there were some things that they did too that really hurt Job as well. And so we want to consider his friends and consider 3 lessons we can learn from his friends that I hope can help us comfort those who may be grieving. So before we get in and we talk about these lessons we can learn from his friends, John, would you kind of just give us a brief overview of Job's grief once again to make sure we're all on the same page?
Right. We still remember Job lived in the land of Uz, very affluent individual. We find him going and experiencing a succession of losses. He lost his livestock, he lost servants, he lost his children, and all those things were very painful to him. And he was dealing with them successfully, and one after the other, and then it got to the point to where he just had to sit down in some sackcloth and ashes, and even got to a point to where he was grieving so that he even shaved his head. So he went through the grieving process. He was in excruciating pain, sadness, and but he wasn't alone, as we'll find as we continue to read, that there were other folks who were by him who cared for him, but perhaps didn't go about it in the right way of doing it.
So as you said, we see Job here in a really low point of his life, or he's really hurting and really struggling with this grief in his life. But the majority really of the book of Job focuses on the interactions Job had with his friends as they were there supposedly trying to comfort him. So throughout this time, there are a number of things that we can look at and we can learn from his friends. Some good things and some bad things that maybe we need to consider that can help us as we try to comfort those who are grieving. So here's the first thing we can learn from them. The first lesson from Job's friends is that there's power in being present.
Yes.
When comforting someone who's grieving, there's power in being present. John, what kind of an impact can our presence have on someone that's grieving?
Well, I think when you know you're not alone, that helps a lot. To feel like it's not just you against the world, but to have someone there with you, to know that they actually care about what's happening or what has happened or what you're going through. Yeah, take about these friends. They came from a great distance. Somehow they corresponded together, and they let it be known what they wanted to do, and they all ended up in the same place at the same time for the same purpose. and that is to be there in their mind to comfort their friend Job. I mean, just to see somebody and to know that they care is simply a comforting thing.
When we're present with those who are grieving, yeah, it shows them we care.
Yes.
It shows them we love them. It reminds them they're not alone.
Right.
And it also allows them to have a sounding board if they need to talk through what they're dealing with.
Right.
There are great benefits for us just being present with someone that's hurting, and maybe you've experienced grief in your life, and you know that feeling when someone you love comes and just sits down with you and gives you a hug. You see, our presence is a powerful thing.
Yes.
And I think Job's friends understood that, and we see the effect of it in Job's life. You see, in Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, as we're introduced to Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, we see where they come and they decide they just want to be with Job. They see him mourning, they see him hurting. So for 7 days, we're told they sat there with him, and were just there in his presence. They didn't have to say anything.
No.
They didn't have to do anything. Just being there was enough to show their love and their support for their friend Job.
Yes.
Being present is such an important thing, and sometimes we don't realize how great of an impact it can really have. But it sometimes we've heard the phrase "action speaks louder than words."
Yes.
And sometimes just being there can make a huge difference.
Right. I think you're right. I mean, as the other adage simply said, you said a lot when you said nothing at all. So I just think just being there, you're not alone, you're not lonely, and I tell you, when I've chatted with people who are going through a loss like that, it's just that when they are alone, that's when a whole lot of things come into their thinking, and they just feel like they're powerless, helpless, and sometimes they even get to the point of where they're even hopeless. So just being there is a great thing.
We recognize the importance and the significance of being present. But sometimes I think we have in our minds that there is a time when our presence is important, and once we've reached that time, then it's not as significant. I think about someone that's really hurting and someone that's grieving, and how we're oftentimes very good of being there and being present during the initial loss. But what I've experienced is a lot of times, and I know I've struggled with this too sometimes, is when after the funeral, after the graveside, and those rituals have been wrapped up.
Yes.
A lot of times we end up going back to our normal lives, and we go back to normal while the person that's grieving is oftentimes just beginning their grief.
Yes.
And so when we think about comforting those who are grieving, our presence is not just important during the time of the initial loss, but it's so crucial through the extended future to help those who may be hurting and grieving.
Yes. I tell you what, I think from a cultural standpoint, that's the way we've always done things. And I do believe that the intention of it is that we've been around, you've gone through a lot of things, you've making preparation to do this and making preparation to do that, to be here or to be over there. And I do believe that most people, for all good intents and purposes, are thinking that since that's been such a burdensome time, task-filled time, that if everybody just kind of back off, that you'll be able to kind of relax, rest, and try to, regain some sense of strength. I think that's what we're thinking about, but I'm agreeing with you that this is the time when they need you more. Yes.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes we think that the individual just maybe needs to be alone. They've had so much going on. Let's just let them have some time. But for a lot of people, that time alone in silence and things can really hurt that individual.
Oh yes, yes.
You even think about how for a lot of people, even years that go by past the time of the loss, there are still events and certain times in life every year that individual is going to be reminded of their grief, and they're going to be hurting, and they need someone to be present with them for comfort. You think about holidays, and maybe you've experienced holidays without a loved one, and you know how hard that can be. Or maybe it's birthdays, or maybe it's even the anniversary of the loss. For years, those times, those dates are going to be times of pain.
Oh yes.
And so people that are grieving, they need others to be present with them, to provide comfort and support during those times, even years after their loss.
Oh yes.
And so being present isn't just something that's crucial immediately at the loss, but we need to be present with those who are grieving for extended period of time, because that grief never necessarily goes away.
That's true. That's true. And like you said, that, as you said, it doesn't go away. It makes it timing and adjustment, makes it much more manageable to where there is a higher and higher level of functionality. But grief doesn't necessarily just disappear after a certain period of time.
So as we think about comforting those who are grieving, we need to understand there's power in our presence, and we need to realize the significance of simply sitting next to someone, wrapping our arms around someone, and letting them know we're there. So as we're comforting those who are grieving, let's remember the power of our presence.
Yes.
But let's think about a second lesson we can learn from Job's friends.
Yes.
The second thing we can learn is that we must choose our words wisely when it comes to comforting those who are grieving. Many people, I think, have really good intentions in trying to say something they think will help someone that's grieving. But it's easy for us to end up doing more harm than good when it comes to saying words to those who are grieving. Sometimes maybe we even say things that are true or things that are right. But just because we say something that's right, that doesn't mean that that the person is ready to hear it.
That's true.
Or that the person's ready to accept it. Sometimes our timing is all off, and it can end up doing more harm than good. So it's important that we choose wisely what we say when we're trying to help someone that's grieving.
Right. I think we take a word and drink from the proverb wisdom well, and I think that we ought to be swift to hear and slow to speak sometimes, and even like the book of James tells us, that the tongue can really do some damage. And once we realize that those things are said and done, it's not as though we can reach out and grab them and pull them back in, and somehow we have a magical eraser and all of that is soon forgotten. That leaves a mark upon someone's memory that really impacts their emotion, and in some way, even if in the limited short term, will impact that person's grief process.
For sure. And it's really interesting because we just finished talking about how much impact our presence can have.
Yes.
And sometimes we can be there with someone, we can be comforting them, we can give them a hug, we can show them through our presence how much we care, but we can open our mouths and ruin everything.
Oh yes.
And the truth is, that's exactly what we see happen in the book of Job. Right? You think about those 7 days that Job's friends sat there with Job, and the comfort that Job must have felt from that. But they decided that wasn't enough. And so they all began opening their mouths, and as a result, they did more harm than good. We see in Job chapters 4 and 5, we see his friend Eliphaz, who begins this discussion, and he begins telling Job that he has sinned against God, and that God is chastening him. So he opens his mouth and begins telling Job all of these things. And Bildad, his second friend, kind of piles onto it, and we see in Job chapter 8 where he's telling Job, "Hey, you need to repent. Again, you've done something wrong." And then we see Zophar, his third friend, in Job chapter 11, again continues to urge Job to repent. You see, all of them here are saying that the reason that Job is in such grief and the reason he's in so much pain and suffers so much loss is because he has sinned and disobeyed God.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to say things that they think and they hope are going to be helpful. But the truth is, everything they're saying is really hurting Job, to the point that in Job chapter 16, in verse 2, he's reflecting on his friends, and he says of them, he said that they are miserable comforters. Right?
Okay.
Notice this whole discussion here. I think it's really fascinating. Job chapter 16, starting in verse 2, the Bible says, I've heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Shall words of wind have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? I also could speak as you do. If your soul were in my soul's place, I could heap up words against you and shake my head at you. But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the comfort of my lips would relieve your grief. So here, as Job is reflecting on the words that his friends had spoken to him, he says, "You're miserable comforters. Your words weren't helpful, but instead you're heaping up words against me that are just making things worse and making my grief worse."
Okay.
And he said, "You're not relieving my grief, but instead you're piling on to my grief." You know, they had good intentions. They were hoping to help him.
Yes.
But instead, their words hurt him more than anything.
Yeah. I tell you what, I like the way Job said to them. He really talking about the winds, and he was really letting them know in a very kind way, even if they were pretty rough with him. He was kind of letting them know that they were blowing some hot air. They wasn't really telling the truth about things, or really didn't understand what was really taking place and what had happened altogether. We have to really watch what we say, as well-intentioned as we are. Our words can help, they can heal, but our words also can really hinder and they can hurt. And so we have to be careful what we say, when we say it, and also, most importantly, of how we say it.
You're right. And I think there are times that that maybe we fall into a similar boat as to what Job's friends were in, and we're talking to someone and trying to help someone that's grieving, and we feel like we need to say something, but sometimes what we say ends up doing more harm.
Yes.
Can you think of, give us an example or two of some things that maybe you've heard people say that were well intentioned, but really don't help someone that's grieving?
Oh, I know. I've been around and I've heard them go over to the person who is really hurting, the loss, grieving, and they would simply tell them, "Honey, I understand how you feel. I've gone through the same thing." That would be one of the things I've heard constantly, that over and over. They're trying to show empathy, but they really don't know how they feel. And then number two, I've heard somebody said, it's part of God's will. The Lord doesn't make any mistakes. I've heard that said over and over again. So that is supposed to intimate to the person that what happened, God did it, and if God did it, we ought to accept it and some way and somehow move on. Those are a couple of things I've heard.
I think you're right, and thinking about that that phrase, I know exactly how you feel.
Yeah.
We started this episode of this podcast by talking about those mediators of mourning and how everyone's mediators are going to be different. So even though we may have suffered the same kind of loss, that doesn't mean that we feel the same way as the other person.
That's correct.
So it's important that we don't say things that maybe aren't true just because we think they sound good in the time.
That's right.
But I think about other things that I hear people say, and maybe after someone has grieved for a while, maybe you've heard someone say, well, it's just time to move on.
Time to move on.
And we talked earlier about how there's no set timetable for grief, and
right.
So even though someone maybe hasn't grieved at the speed we think they should have, that doesn't mean that they're grieving wrong. And so we don't have a right to tell someone they need to move on.
They need to move on.
We need to let them grieve how they grieve. But maybe another thing you've heard is someone say, well, you still have time to have another child, or to find another husband, or whatever it may be. And the truth is, there's no replacing the person that we lost. So to say there's still time to find someone else maybe sounds good, but it's not going to help at all.
No.
So there are a number of things that, again, well-intentioned, we say that we think can help, but sometimes end up causing more harm than good. And we need to be careful about the things we say. But the reality is there are many things that we can and maybe should say to those who are grieving that can be helpful. Can you give us a few things that maybe we should say to those who are grieving?
Oh, you just simply just say, I'm here for you. I love you. I care for you. I'll be coming around and check on you, see how you think I could do for you. Just let me know, or you might can get with some of their family members and figure out what needs to be done so you can handle it that way.
You're right. It seems like the things, the words we say to people that can be the greatest benefit to those who are comforting are the words that show them they're not alone.
Right.
I love you. I'm there for you. I care for you. I'm praying for you.
Right.
You know, when we're thinking about and we feel like we need to say something to someone that's grieving, maybe the most important thing for us to understand is that we just need to make sure that they don't feel alone or like they're going through this by themselves.
That's correct.
So as we're considering the words to say, we need to be very careful that we're not saying something that sounds like it may be helpful, but it comes across in such a way that's going to do more harm than good.
Oh yeah.
So words to those who are comforting can only bring comfort if the right words are said and they're said at the right time.
Yes.
Otherwise, we're going to do some damage to those who are grieving. So we need to be wise in choosing the words we say to those who are grieving. So that's the second lesson we learn from Job's friends, that we need to choose our words wisely.
All right.
But let's notice the third and final lesson from Job's friends. This third lesson is that we don't have to try to fix their grief.
Right.
As I think about Job and his relationship with his friends, I get the sense that they were motivated to try to help Job. They were motivated to try to fix Job's grief. They wanted him to no longer experience grief anymore.
Yes.
They thought if we can convince Job to repent, then it's going to save him from experiencing future grief moving forward. So that was what they worked on. They pushed Job to do that. But here was the problem was, Job wasn't experiencing grief and loss as a result of sin.
That's correct.
All the way back at the beginning of the book of Job, actually at the end of chapter 1, we're told this about Job. It said, in all of this, in all his suffering, in all his grief, and all his loss, he did not sin nor charge God with wrong. So we see that this loss he suffered had nothing to do with his sin.
That's true.
And in fact, as Job is defending himself to his friends throughout this book, we see him continue to reiterate that fact. He didn't do anything wrong.
That's right.
He didn't sin against God. He's been faithful. He's an upright man. And so his friends were trying to fix a problem that wasn't a problem. And as a result, they started hurting Job.
That's right.
And instead of helping relieve his pain and grief, they were adding on and piling on to his grief. So as we think about someone that's grieving, why is it that oftentimes we feel like we have to fix something in order to bring them comfort?
Well, I tell you what, sometimes either we're oblivious to it or we just don't admit it, is that sometimes in helping them or fixing them, we are in turn fixing ourselves. Because if you said that we talk about the 7 days that they spent with them, and when you watch someone who's hurting, someone that you love who's hurting, there's no way that it cannot impact you emotionally. And there's no way that it cannot impact you physically if you are around for a long period of time. And so sometimes helping others in turn helps us. So not only will Job be moving forward, but they who his friends who are emotionally invested will be able to move forward as well. So we don't always acknowledge that, but that's generally what happens.
So maybe we think if we can fix them, then it's going to fix us.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. I think maybe another thing, reason why we try to fix people, fix something for someone when they're grieving, is because we don't like to see people we love in pain.
No.
And it hurts us to see them in pain, and so we want to relieve their pain. So what can I do to fix that?
Right.
But the truth is, more often than not, people don't need us to fix their grief.
No.
Instead, they need us to help. They need us to help them grieve.
That's it. That's it.
You know, grief is a normal thing, and we talked about it a lot last week. Grief is normal.
Yes.
And everyone experiences it. And so, oftentimes, people don't need us to fix their grief because they need to go through that.
They need to go through it.
And so, if we try to fix their grief and stop their grief, it could end up potentially adding more problems to them.
Oh yes.
But instead of trying to fix them and stop their grief, there are things that we can do to help people and ease their burden that can help them grieve, help them in their grieving process.
Yes.
You know, I think about maybe it's something as simple as providing a meal for someone that's grieving.
Yes.
Right? We can go and we can offer to show them support and help. There's a need they have. We can meet that need and fix that need for them, but it's not going to fix their grief.
No.
Maybe it's something like running errands for them or doing chores for them that maybe their loved one had always done, and that this was an extra burden on them, and they were had stress because of this, and we could go and help ease that burden. We're not fixing their grief,
No.
but we're helping a problem
Yes.
they have.
Yes.
So as we think about comforting those who are grieving, more often than not, people don't need us to fix their grief,
No.
but they just need us to help them grieve.
That's it. I'll tell you what you need to do is that when we try to fix it, we're breaking it, so to speak. And when you do some of the things that you've suggested, recommended, that to do some things for them, because if they have to do it, they have to take a break from the grieving process, which kind of slows it down. And sometimes, perhaps of whatever it is they need to do, and for how long they need to do it, may lose some ground, so to speak, in the grieving process. So they will have to go back and try to pick back up and catch up where it was, so to speak, to move forward. We don't fix them. We allow the grief process to continue so that it would increase their levels of functionality, which would be showing us clearly that they are moving through the cycle of the process very well.
Right. Again, grief is a normal thing, and so it's not something that needs to be fixed. But what we can do, if we feel like we need to do something, is we can find things that can help ease the burden on that individual, that can help them grieve.
Yes.
So as we've looked at Job's friends, we've considered, we've learned three lessons that I hope can really help us as we're striving to comfort those who may be hurting in our lives.
Yes.
But maybe the most important thing we need to remember is that in moments of grief, in moments of pain, we should look to the ultimate source of comfort, which is God.
Yes.
In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul talks about the significance of God as a comforter, and as a result, our ability to comfort others.
Gotcha.
Notice what the Apostle Paul said here in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. It said, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in trouble with the
Yes.
comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. So here, as we think about what Paul is saying, he's saying God is the God of all comfort.
Yes.
He's the God that can provide the ultimate source of comfort for us, and he wants to, and he's willing to. But he does so that we, in turn,
Yes.
can comfort others who may be
There you
hurting.
go.
You see, God created us to be comforters.
Okay.
He created us to have the ability to offer comfort and offer support to those who may be hurting.
Great, great. I'll tell you what I like the word, what you just saying, that God comforts us. We use our grief to be able to comfort others. And I like the word comfort means to come beside someone. We can't stand off from a distance and really be the comforters that other people need. You mentioned earlier just a hug or just this or just a tap on the hand, anything like that, let them know that you're not alone. And so we have to move out. At least Joe's friends moved and made some moves to do it, and we'll have to do the same. We need to come forward, stand by their side, be right there with them, and that way they can kind of move on and walk through their grieving process.
You're right. You know, there's a phrase that we used a lot today, and when it comes to grief, it's a phrase we do hear a lot, and that's the phrase "well-intentioned."
Well-intentioned.
When we are going and trying to comfort someone that's grieving, we have good intentions.
Oh, yes.
But good intentions don't undo bad comfort.
No.
We could be the most well-intentioned person in the world, but if we say something or do something that isn't helpful, then all that person's gonna remember is that hurtful thing that was done or said.
Right.
They're not going to care about. They'd almost rather you weren't present because they wouldn't be feeling that pain.
Right.
So as we think about being comforters, we need to remember the power of our presence.
Yes.
We need to remember the significance of just being there with someone that's hurting, to be able to comfort that person that's hurting by just showing them we care.
Yes.
We need to remember, we need to learn.
We need to learn.
To choose our words wisely.
Yes.
Our words can help and heal, or our words can be devastating when it comes to helping someone that's grieving. But third, we need to learn that we don't have to try to fix someone else's grief.
That's correct.
But instead, we need to find ways to help them grieve.
Yes.
And when we can do that, and the greatest way we can do that is by pointing them to God,
Amen.
the source of all comfort.
Yes.
And by doing so, we can help them move forward and help them grieve the way that's healthy and productive for them.
That's correct.
So we recognize that grief is real. We recognize that many that may be listening have experienced grief or may be experiencing grief right now. And we want you to know that we care for you and that we love you.
Oh, yes.
And that if there's something we can do to assist you and help you and offer comfort to you, we want to be able to do that. Please, you can reach out to us, and if you're struggling with grief in a serious way and you can't reach out to one of us, we want to encourage you to find someone that you can talk to help you in your grief.
Yes.
But as we are reaching out and looking to those that we love who may be grieving, let's understand that we have a responsibility. And in our responsibility, we can do something that can really help and benefit and provide great comfort.
Yes.
But we can also do things that are going to hurt. So we need to be wise in what we do as we strive to comfort those who are hurting. We want to thank you for joining us on this episode of the Abundant Life Podcast. We hope that you'll join us every Thursday at noon as we continue to deal with these different issues that maybe we may be struggling, or those we love may be struggling in this life. Thank you for joining us.